Hi everyone, my name is Dan Adler and I'd like to welcome you back to episode 2 of Active Listening in Jazz. And in this episode we'll talk about form. And form is first and foremost all about synchronizing different wavelengths. You could think about it. I've been reading this book lately, which is a very interesting book about sync. How synchronization happens in nature and at different levels and by different species, how oscillators can sync up together, and everything in jazz is about being in synchronized time. So this happens at a very granular level where we're listening to a beat and there's a certain pulse and there are rhythmic movements against that pulse. And then it happens at larger units where you are going to see groups of 4 bars or 8 bars or 12 bars. And in this particular episode, we're going to focus on one simple thing that is probably at the real foundation of jazz, and that is the blues form. And the blues form is all about something really simple, and all I want you to do at the end of this episode is to be able to count till 12. Very simple and very practical, because this will allow you to recognize the blues form wherever you hear it. When you hear it in a jazz setting, when you hear it in rock and roll, when you hear it in old Delta blues, and you hear it in any form of blues that is kind of the building block of so much of the music we listen to, both in jazz and rock and roll and everything up to current music. So the main thing that you have to understand about the blues is its form. The blues is built of, and again, I'm not going into the whole history. I want you to go and research that on your own. But I want you to just think about the form of the blues. The form of the blues is basically 3 lines, if you think about it, or 3 units of 4 bars. So what's a bar? You've all been in some high school band or something and you know how to count till 4. You know that a musical bar is a synchronized rhythm of 4 beats per bar. That means you count to 4 and then you start counting again. So and units of 4 bars can be put together. So 4 units of bars in 4/4 or 4/4 rhythms would be essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, and multiply that 4 times. So we repeat the unit of 4, that is 1 bar, and then each unit of 4 bars gets repeated 3 times. So you're looking at 2 rhythms or 2 frequencies of rhythms. One is at the single bar level, one is at the 4 bar level, and then you have 3 of those, and that repeats the form. And so the form is the slowest moving unit, and all we want to do in this video is learn to count the form. And why is this important? Because this is the first step towards not feeling lost within a jazz context. If you can count the form, if you can recognize groups of 4 bars, if you can recognize where an 8-bar grouping ends, if you can recognize a blues form, then you're already familiar. You're feeling like there is something that's repeating and there's something you can connect to. When you're just listening to it and it's just an endless array of beats and bars, and the 1 is coming here and the 2 is coming there and you're not sure where it's happening, then you feel lost. But when you can count the rhythms and when you know where things are starting and ending, then you have a much greater chance of keeping track of the music and staying focused on what people are doing. So we're going to start really simple. We're going to start with a 12-bar blues. And in this 12-bar blues, there's not going to be any soloist. And so that is going to make it much easier to count. And all we're going to focus on is counting the bars, counting within the bars and counting the bars. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. That was the first row. Second row. 3, 5, 6, 7, 8. That was the second row. Third row, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's the 12 bar blues. 1, 2, first row, 3, 4. Second row, 5, 6, 7, 8. Third row, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's the 12th bar. Now, if you don't count, you can still hear maybe when the first row ends. 4. That's the 4th. We're in the second row now. You're not counting, but maybe your foot is tapping. Second row ended. Third row, 9, 10, 11, 12. So you're starting to hear how a blues sounds. 3 rows of 4 bars each. The end of the first row, 4th bar, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're not counting. We're just feeling it. 11, 12, 1. You always hear the 1, the beginning of the 12 bars. Okay, second row. Nine, 10, 11, 12, and so on. So you're beginning to see how this counting works for the blues. 3 systems of 4 bars each, creating together a cycle of 12 bars. And that's how all blues works in general. And you can follow along with almost any blues, whether it's slow or fast, whether it's somebody singing, whether it's somebody playing, and we'll get to that in a minute. By the way, if you're a musician and you looked at the chords there, those are not exactly the chords that were being played in the backing track, but let's ignore that for the moment. So let's talk for a minute about historical blues and certainly the blues that you hear sung and all the forms of rock and roll and so on. So when this form always stays the same. The form is still the three lines or the 3 groupings of 4 bars, but what you see is that the lyrics typically have a different structure. The lyrics are basically a repeat of the same line once, then the second time is the same as the first in most cases, and then the third is sort of like a punchline. So it's almost like the format of, I wouldn't say a joke, because some of them are very, very sort of sad and serious topics, but they basically have like a format of like, a question and a repeat of the question, and then an answer or some kind of other of conclusion. So it's like a short story in a way. So I'm sure you all know the hound dog from Elvis Presley, and you ain't nothing but a hound dog crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit, and you ain't no friend of mine. So that is the way it works. The first 2 systems are repeated. The first 2 are repeated, and then you get the third one, which kind of resolves it, usually in a surprising way. So let's see how that system of lyrics works together with the 12-bar form. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. early 12-bar
It
blues.
carried me to the courthouse.
2,
Lordy, how I was
3, 4.
It carried me to the courthouse.
6,
Lordy, how I was
7, 8,
They give me
9,
60 days in jail, and
10,
money couldn't pay my
11,
fine.
12.
60 days.
Okay, so you see how that works. The lyrics and the form work together to create this unique creation that we call the blues. Now, what is important is for you to do some background research, go back to some blues songs you know, to some rock and roll songs you know, and try to do this counting. And of course, if you're listening to jazz and you find blues, try to apply this counting. And this is, now we talked about, we heard some backing tracks which didn't have a soloist, and we heard some tracks with lyrics. Now we're going to listen to some real jazz blues, and in this case it's Oscar Peterson with his famous trio. And this is going to be a lot harder to keep track of, number one, because it's going to be much faster, and number two, because you're going to see that the trio is working against the rhythm. As you're counting and as you're trying to keep track of the form, you're going to see what you've probably heard of as syncopation, and of all sorts of games with against the time that really give it the feel that we call the jazzy feel. But again, in order to know where you are in the form, and in order to know what it is that they are referencing, you have to keep track of this form. If you're not keeping track of the form, then you're kind of missing out on the bluesy sort of historical element of this whole performance, and you're kind of just hearing the very first level of intelligence that's going on here. There's a whole other level about how they're dealing with the chords, how they're dealing with the reharmonization, what they're doing with the rhythms and all of these things. And so there are many, many layers that are going on here, and there's layers of interplay and how they relate to each other, and how a phrase on the piano suddenly reflects itself in the bass, and so a bass note then pushes Oscar Peterson into another direction, and how the drums are interacting, and all of these things are aspects and different layers on top of each other. But the very basic layer is the basic layer of knowing what the form is and being able to track and keep counting that 12-bar form. So I'm going to try to count with you, and then what I'm going to ask you to do is to find some blues on your own. There's a million of them on YouTube, a million jazz blues on YouTube, and just try to count it out. Try to stay with the soloist, stay with the different players, and just try to keep the form and make sure that you know where you are at any moment in the blues form. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this concludes the second episode of Active Listening in Jazz, and I hope that you are starting to get some understanding of the form in jazz, and we'll talk a lot more about that, about different forms, but really the blues is at the basis of everything, and I hope you start listening a little more actively, at least to jazz blues at this stage, and I'll see you in episode number 3.